It's fantastic to have you all here this morning. This is the last day of the conference, and it's also the last day of Heart Week, which has been running in Australia all week this week. So a bit of a common theme with heart being the centre of primary health care. As Jackie mentioned, I'm one of the dietitians at Unilever, and it's really my role, or all dietitians' role, to keep on top of nutritional science and the emerging research that's coming out, particularly in the area of heart health. I think with nutrition science, because it is an evolving science, it's really important to be open to new research that's coming out, but also have the skill and understanding to interpret that information and understand what it means for your patients and clients. And I think with the great number of papers coming out, both new papers and also retrospective papers, I think health professionals and also general public are quite confused. A lot of these papers are reported in the media in very short format, and that's really the context for today, is to talk about the science around saturated fat and heart health, and also to try and put it back into context, into some easy to understand advice that you can then pass on to your patients and clients. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Professor Paul Nestel here this morning, who's going to talk about the science around saturated fat and heart health, and also accredited practicing dietitian Nicole Senior. So Paul will speak first. I'm just going to give you a quick bio about Professor Nestel. He's on the senior faculty at the Baker IDI Heart and Diabetes Institute, based here in Melbourne. Professor Nestel has been involved with nutrition-related research and nutrition-relevant health policies spanning over several decades. It's really wonderful to have someone of his level of experience and also perspective in the area of this research, who can take you through the science and has had personal involvement in this area for many years. Professor Nestel has also served on a number of national and international working parties on policies related to nutrition and cardiovascular health. And in addition, he's also published more than 460 peer-reviewed research articles on health policy papers, which for me, I've just started my PhD, I'm absolutely in awe of. I think I'm just about to be a co-author on one paper, so I've got a long way to go for 460. So please welcome Professor Paul Nestel.
What I want to do is not just talk about fats and oils alone, but put them in the context of a whole diet, because it's really the mixture of carbohydrates, the quality of carbohydrate, and also the nature of the food and the food matrix in which the fats find themselves, which will determine the extent to which these different ways of eating are related to cardiovascular disease. I think the one thing that everybody agrees upon, and every authority, health authority, every dietary guideline, every cardiovascular guideline, now puts the emphasis more on the whole pattern of eating rather than on individual nutrients. Individual nutrients have got an important role to play, but when it comes to public health policy, there is virtually no disagreement about this particular slide. And some of the foods that you've got on the table are shown there, and I think you know that: whole grains, unsaturated oils, low-fat dairy, lean poultry, fruit and vegetables, and nuts and pulses. As against that, fried foods, fatty meats. Processed meats are becoming definitely a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and also cancer. And saturated fats, including tropical fats, is important in the context of a population that eats a lot of fat. In countries where fat consumption is very low, in many of the Pacific Islands, it doesn't make any difference whether they have coconut oil or palm oil. Here it does make a difference. And of course, trans fats are the major culprit, but nowadays in Australia, just about out of all foods. So for a long time it had been generally accepted that there is this association between saturated fat consumption and future cardiovascular disease across populations in cohort studies and case control studies. And virtually every authoritative organization across the Western world does include eat less saturated fats in its guideline. But as I'll show you, it's a little bit more complicated. But for a public health policy, it's important to emphasize individual nutrients as well as the whole pattern. In more recent years, and now I'm talking sort of 10, 15 years, meta-analyses, which as you know are analyses of all the evidence from the best types of trials, and not the Mickey Mouse trials, which are often included by people who want to dissent from the overall picture, have been less conclusive. Murray Ski from New Zealand published a very good review in 2009 where he showed that some of the data were not quite as clear-cut as we thought. And then a number of us met in Copenhagen in 2011. We reviewed the whole area and came to a similar conclusion that whereas one could make some firm conclusions about saturated fats, not all saturated fats were the same. And the important considerations were that one had to take into account, as had been known since 1950s, when Ansel Keys first published his 7-country study, that the mixture of polyunsaturated fatty acids and saturated fatty acid was the important factor. And then more recently, the amount of carbohydrate and the nature of carbohydrate. And then, as I said earlier, the food matrix. And here we have some very interesting data on dairy fats, which are not quite in the same category as the saturated fats from meats, for instance. So what I think everybody agrees about now is that it's a total fat which is not nearly as important as the quality of the fats and oils. And I did say before that in a country like Australia, where 1/3 of all energy is eaten as fat, the picture is different from many of the Pacific Islands, where they still eat less than 10% of their energy as fats and oils. And then, as you now know, carbohydrates, some are good, some are not so good, and they depend pretty much on the degree to which starches are rapidly or not rapidly broken down in the gut and the amount of fiber that they contain. So, as I said, recent meta-analyses reiterate now the importance of linoleic acid or polyunsaturated oils. And again, without exception, this is pretty much part of all guidelines. Not necessarily linoleic acid alone, it's unsaturated oils. So in some countries, obviously, they favor olive oil. In other countries, they favor linoleic acid-rich oil, sunflower, safflower, canola, etc. So it's important to recognize the totality of the evidence that goes back a good half-century and really hasn't changed very much. Now, the problem with dietary studies is, unlike drug studies, it's very, very difficult to do proper, very large, long-term randomized control trials, because in an open population, you can't really control exactly what's going on. There were 2 studies, however, that started, believe it or not, in the late 1950s, 60s, and were published in the late 60s, early 70s, when ethics were also not quite as rigorous as they are today. And so these studies were carried out in nursing homes, in mental hospitals, in VA hospitals in the United States, where people stayed forever and anon. And so they were really human guinea pigs, and they were the only ones that showed quite clearly that if one compares one mental hospital where everyone ate saturated fats versus another mental hospital where they had a high polyunsaturated fat intake, that cardiovascular mortality was much higher where saturated fats predominated. But the amounts were quite high, and I'll just show you one slide. This is from the Los Angeles study, and as you see there, it was an 8-year dietary trial in 800-odd men, started in 1959. And that's the last time that a major randomized control trial was done on dietary fats. You will notice, however, that they used virtually pharmacological doses of linoleic acid, 38% of energy, versus 10% of energy for the control group, which is a little bit more than we recommend for the normal population. Nevertheless, it had the desired outcome in that they were able to show, there are two lines there, it's the cumulative incidence of cardiovascular disease, down the bottom it's years of study. So at 8 years you can see that those who ate the control diet had a much higher incidence of cardiovascular events compared to the lower line, the broken dots, the broken line, who had the high linoleic acid intake. And the same was found in the mental hospital studies. So both of them agreed, but that was the end of RCTs for fats. However, there's as you know, the nurses are a great bunch of people in whom to follow events, and I'm sure all of you have heard of the Nurses' Health Study that's been going now for 40 years in the United States. And as we go through some of these slides, you will see that every decade the Nurses' Health Study comes up, and the conclusions become less and less powerful compared to the beginning. But here we have, which is a nice way of, these are the food intakes, and they're looking at linoleic acid, and the horizontal line are the deciles of P to S ratio, and along the vertical axis it's a frequency of cardiovascular risks. And what you see clearly is that the nurses who had higher P to S ratios had lower events over time. At that stage, this was done in 1999. The study had been going for about a decade. And then we come to 2009. This is a very good review, a meta-analysis by a Dutch woman, Jacobson. And the bottom line is that PUFA intake was inversely related to CHD death. She looked at the best 11 American and European cohorts. So from now on, there are no RCTs, randomized clinical trials. So it's following cohorts of people, such as I think there were about 40 or 50,000 nurses, 40 to 50,000 physicians, and dentists and others over years to see how they fared, and with frequent food frequency questionnaires, their dietary intakes could be monitored. And you can see at that point, she looked at the meta-analyses at roughly 300,000 people over a follow-up period between 4 and 10 years with a very large number of coronary deaths. So you could take a very clear statistical evidence from that. And what she did and what others have done is they've said, well, we now know that it's a mix of saturated fats and unsaturated oils, and such as linoleic acid and oleic acid that matter. So what would happen if we substituted 5% of the saturated fat in the diet by 5% unsaturated oils? And there were a large number of people who had that kind of differential, the high saturated fat eaters versus the high unsaturated oil eaters. And at that stage, from those 11 big studies, there was a significant 13% reduction in relation to PUFA when PUFA substituted for saturated fats. MUFA, even though olive oil is heavily favored everywhere, it's not easy to show in these large studies that eating more oleic acid is protective. Some have shown it, some have not. With linoleic acid, it's almost invariable. So now we go to 2011, and further randomized controlled trials. And of course, the numbers are now much larger. The number of people with coronary heart disease are greater. And what they found, and I will summarize all that in the last couple of slides, in about 8 or 9 slides. They compared from the 8 large trials that they decided to take, roughly a 15% intake of linoleic acid versus 5%. So people who take in a fair amount, 15% is about the upper 20% of the population in those countries. And there was a 19% reduction for coronary heart disease. And here they found pretty much what Jacobson found 2 years previously in a different set of clinical trials, that for every 5% increase in linoleic acid, there was a 10% reduction for coronary heart disease. They also looked at carbohydrates for the first time, and they found that if one replaced the same amount of saturated fat, 5% of energy, with an equivalent amount of energy from carbohydrates, or with monounsaturated oils, there was no clear benefit. But as you will see, as the numbers increase, going now to eventually to 2015, you will see a clear picture coming up. To anticipate, yes, oleic acid does also have an inverse correlation with a CHD, as does a low glycemic carbohydrate diet. So, as you know, much of the controversy has been whether PUFA consumption will increase the risk. And in laboratories, one can show that the more double bonds there are in a fatty acid, the more likely it is to be a pro-oxidant. But there are a large number of human studies, of course, that looked at that clearly, and those fears certainly do not occur in vivo. And I'll just show you one slide. If you look at the right-hand side, which is the black slide, which relates to the linoleic acid intake, and you're all familiar with CRP. So here we look at the inflammatory biomarkers, which had also been shown in cell studies to be correlated to the amount of linoleic acid in the dish. But in human studies, you can see there are, if you look at the black bars, the quartiles of omega-6 fatty acids, not only in the diet but also in the plasma. And if you compare those who ate the least, which is the main black bar, compared to those who ate the most, as we go down the scale, the CRP levels fall dramatically. So there's no evidence in vivo for either pro-oxidant or pro-inflammatory concerns. So let's go on to the carbohydrate now, a mixture of both saturated fats, carbohydrates, etc. And this is another study, a 12-year study in Denmark. You can see 50,000 people, nearly 2,000 new cases of MIs. And this was published by Jacobson in 2010. And what she found was that in that population, replacing saturated fat with carbohydrate showed no reduction in infarctions. And that was the first time that that was clearly shown. But she did show that substituting with low GI carbohydrate, there was a 12% reduction, although that was not significant. But on the other hand, those people who ate a high GI carbohydrate, high GI starches and sugars, they had a 33% increase in their risk. So that was the first demonstration that the quality of carbohydrate matters as well as the quality of the fats and oils. So I've just shown you the Danish study. So the lower half of the slide is a meta-analysis of 6 recent reports published up to 2010, which looked at carbohydrates again. And it was not quite as consistent as a single Danish study, but high GI was associated more CHD events, but for some reason only in women and in elderly people. But nevertheless, it shows that there's a probable and significant association between high GI food consumption and increased risk of CHD. And that becomes stronger as we go along. So, I'll skip this one. I want to get on to dairy foods, because not all saturated fats or sources of saturated fats have been found to be equally disadvantageous as far as CHD is concerned. Now, there had been some very good studies earlier to show that countries that ate a lot of dairy foods, particularly Finland, you may remember, if you read the literature, were at the very top of the global CHD event score. So people felt, obviously, dairy fats had to be a bad source of saturated fats. But, and I was one of the first actually to notice that in some of these population studies, the authors would say that for some reason, whereas butter was clearly associated with more CHD, cheese was not. And from that came studies that showed that cheese raised LDL cholesterol less than butter and not clearly associated with CHD risk. And then, furthermore, there was probably the fermented dairy foods, especially yogurt, that were highly protective. But butter consistently is associated with increased risk, irrespective of what the dairy lobby says, which I can't understand, because I used to work with the dairy industry, and I told them, look, we know fermented foods are great, we know yogurt's good, we know low-fat dairy foods are good. Why do you keep pushing the notion that butter's good when all the studies show otherwise? But obviously they had stakeholders who were making butter. So anyway, what I want to show here is the 1999 with the 2010 findings. You know, as the nurses got older and had more heart attacks, things changed a bit. So in 1999, the people who looked after the nurses study were absolutely certain that dairy intake was associated with increased risk. Highly significant, p-value of 0.001. But when the nurses had more heart attacks, because there were a large number of them, we're now looking at 2010, there were now 2,200 non-fatal and nearly 1,000 fatal events. And what came out more clearly was the benefit of low-fat dairy and the association of red meat. Remember, this is the United States, where they eat a lot of red meat, which predicted more heart disease, once again showing the difficulty in looking at a single nutrient. What they found that those nurses who over the period of time, and remember they changed, of course, they changed their pattern of eating, those that substituted roughly one low-fat dairy serving per day and ate one serving of meat less had 13% significantly fewer heart attacks. So what are we being served now? Processed meat. Oh my God. Eggs are okay, but processed meat. So we go on, and milk has been looked at very clearly. It's inconclusive. Certainly drinking, those who drink the most milk versus those who drink the least milk show no real difference in cardiovascular outcomes. One reason being is that although milk is looked at as containing saturated fat, there's 4% fat in whole milk, of which only part is saturated fat. So you don't get much saturated fat from milk compared to butter, for instance. Now there are different ways of measuring the intake of dairy foods. And for instance, if you measure the phospholipids, this is a blood lipid, and look at the fatty acids, which sort of 15-0, 17-0, which typically come only from dairy foods, you can get a much better picture of what people have been eating in terms of dairy. And sort of the odds of having a myocardial infarction, there's an overall slight reduced risk for total dairy, with the exception of butter, and cheese and fermented milk showed, again, an inverse relationship to cardiovascular events. I just want to show very quickly that a number of us then looked at, in different countries, did careful studies of cheese versus butter, and all of us found the same, that for the same amount of dairy fat, eating cheese led to a lower LDL cholesterol compared with butter. Now, one of the interesting things that's come up in the last few years is the relationship between dairy fat and diabetes. And quite a number of studies now in large numbers of people over many years have shown that there's an inverse association between future diabetes incidence and dairy consumption, but with low-fat dairy, especially with yogurt. And that's coming up really very firmly. No one knows why. So now let's come back to PUFA for the last few slides. So major prospective studies reported between 2014 and 2016, so that's up to date, confirmed protection when PUFA replaces saturated fats. There's one large study. These are the nurses study and the health professionals in the United States, now followed for 24 to 30 years, huge number of CHD events and multiple dietary records, and higher linoleic acid, those with the highest intake of linoleic acid versus those with the lowest intake of linoleic acid had 20% less CHD. And now, of course, there are a lot more large prospective studies. There are 13, 310,000 healthy subjects with more than 12,000 CHD events. And again, those studies showed the highest linoleic acid consumers versus the lowest linoleic acid consumers had 21% fewer CHD deaths. So that number of 20% is now fairly firm from a large number of studies. And I just want to pay tribute, obviously, to oleic acid, a very large Mediterranean-style dietary study, a very good study out of Spain, published in 2013, called PREDIMED. And they added olive oil to one group and not to another group, and they found that the olive oil supplemented group did have 30% fewer events over nearly 5 years. So within a Mediterranean diet, olive oil is certainly valuable. Now, you all know that plant sterols, and you've got the margarine in front of you. A number of us did studies. I did that for Meadow Lee at the time. So these are metabolic studies where people are very, very carefully followed. And we found that with a conventional or the recommended intake of sterols, about 2.4 grams per day, there was a very big reduction in LDL cholesterol of 13%, even within a PUFA-enriched diet. It was true whether it was in margarine or whether it was in milk. In those days, one could buy it in milk. And even when the people ate butter, which is the third line there, adding the sterol esters to a diet which contained additional butter, there was still a 12% fall in LDL. So sterol esters play an important but much less important role in lowering LDL compared to linoleic acid, but obviously there are no long-term prospective studies on which one can base evidence that this fall in LDL definitely lowers cardiovascular events. But one would imagine that a 12 to 13% reduction would lead to that sort of reduction in CHD. So, finishing up, meta-analysis from prospective studies that was published last year in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, substituting for such saturated fats in the top part. If you do it with MUFA, you do get 10 to 15% less CHD. If you substitute with omega-6, that is linoleic acid, you get 15 to 20% less CHD. Whole grain carbohydrate, 5% less. Trans fats, of course, 5% more. If you substitute, I've got a better slide coming up next, which summarizes that lower part as well. And on the top, we've got, if we substitute saturated fats by an equivalent amount of energy. The brown square is if we substitute with trans fats, and we're now talking about the change in cardiovascular risk. The green bar, if you substitute with monounsaturated oils. The yellow bar, if you substitute with linoleic acid. And the blue bar is if you substitute with whole grain carbohydrates, in other words, healthy carbohydrates. The little red bar above that is if you substitute with sugars and refined carbohydrates. And much the same shows if you substitute carbohydrates, you'll get still the same with linoleic acid. Substituting carbohydrates, linoleic acid, the yellow bar, gives you a 20-25% reduction in CHD. Healthy carbohydrate, the blue bar, gives you also a reduction in CHD. So there I want to finish, and I just want to say one word about omega-3 fatty acids. A number of us were asked by the Heart Foundation to review, we published that this year, review their health policy on omega-3 fatty acids. And what we found was that not all interventions show protection, that eating fish is clearly beneficial, so that's their current position. Fish consumption, but not fish supplements. Probably reduce cardiovascular events. And from many reports, there's no improvement in secondary protection from supplements. So the Heart Foundation has reversed its policy, and it now says fish consumption and not fish supplements is the preferred. Thank you very much.
Today, what I'm going to do is try and turn that quite heavy science, I'm a bit of the light relief this morning, into some practical food type information. And what I'm going to do is, this is what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to talk about how the heck Australians are actually eating at the moment, and we recently had an Australian health survey with dietary questions to help us answer that question. Then we're going to talk about lowering cholesterol with diet. What works? I know you're up against this just about every day in practice, so we're going to see what actually works. I'm also going to address the question about whether the recommendations are changing, and Paul gave an excellent scientific summary about that, but we're going to talk about how it impacts on food choice. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about where patients are at, because as you and I know, there's a lot of confusion out there, there's a lot of mixed messages, people say the darndest things, so we're going to talk about when they're on the right track and when they're not. And then I'm going to give you a final little summary of advice for patients in a nutshell. And we're going to have some time for questions at the end, which is always my favourite part. Okay, so Australians, how are we doing? And you'll note that I managed to find a pie in the shape of the Australian flag. It took me a while, but I found it, yay. And this is kind of symbolic about, how Australians are eating as a nation. Unfortunately, 35% of the kilojoules that we consume on a daily basis come from what we dietitians call discretionary foods. It's a very ungainly term, but I think you and I know what it means. It's not core foods, it's those extras that have got all the additives that we really shouldn't be eating that many of. Okay, 35% of our kilojoules. And kids, it's up around 40%. Okay, so this is a real issue. How are we doing when it comes to saturated fat? Because we heard Paul say that yes, saturated fats are still an issue. The evidence still supports a reduction in those. So how are we doing? Well, we're having about 12% of our kilojoules from saturated fat, and the target is less than 8. So that's where we're at. Where are we getting them from? Well, it's back to the first point about those discretionary foods. We're getting it from cakes, bickies, pastries, meats, processed meats, which I can see you're enjoying a little bit of now. But you do have mushrooms and spinach, so come on, we're all in balance. So yes, we're having too many saturated fats, and it's because we love those sometimes foods a little bit too much. Now, how about the polyunsaturated fats? Because Paul showed us that they're actually quite important. Polyunsaturated fats reduce cardiovascular risk. So, unfortunately, we're not quite making the grade there either. We should be having about 5 to 10% of our kilojoules from what we call PUFAs, or polyunsaturated fatty acids. So we're not quite up there. It's interesting to note that there is a lot of misinformation about polyunsaturates, and everyone kind of worships at the altar of olive oil, but actually there's no polyunsaturated fatty acids in olive oil, very little anyway. It's not a polyunsaturated fat. Interesting. The other thing that's important, because we know nuts are fantastic for cardiovascular health, unfortunately the average Australian eats only 5 grams a day. I think we can call that bugger all, and we need to work harder. So this is where I think you can help. By the way, the target for nuts, 30 grams a day, which is about a handful. So a handful or 2, depending on energy requirements, that's the sweet spot for reducing cardiovascular risk. Okay, so that's how Australians are eating. You know the lie of the land where we have to do better. So with cholesterol, what works? Okay, you probably, Paul's let the cat out of the bag, but basically you need to replace saturated and trans fats with unsaturated fats. That's both polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. If you can achieve that in a person's diet, their risk will go down significantly. What does this mean? It means less sometimes or discretionary food, so less biggies, cakes and fast food. We need to replace butter. We just heard Paul say butter's bad for cardiovascular health, so we need to switch butter for a margarine spread. And there are lots out there and they don't have trans fats, so happy days. Use a variety of plant-based oils. As I said, people always bang on about olive oil. There's lots of other oils they could be using. And, why would you use olive oil to make a curry? There's culinary reasons why it's good to use a variety of oils too, right? I mean, sesame, beautiful in Asian cooking. Canola, good old standard. Sunflower, great. You use the oil that suits the dish and the culinary application. I think we forget that sometimes. Eating nuts and seeds and oily fish, these are really heart-friendly foods, so let's encourage those. And you know what? It's less about preaching to people not to eat stuff, but to get them to eat the good stuff. It's so much more palatable message, and we know that it works. And choosing reduced fat dairy products. And so things like light milk, we know that the dietary guidelines recommend that from 2 years of age, kids can have light milk. So a good family milk is light milk. We know that yogurt's particularly protective, so bring it. Butter's not technically in the dairy food category, just so you know. It's milk, cheese, yogurt. Yeah. Okay, so what else works? Let's just go into a little bit more detail about what I mean by polyunsaturated or good fats. We know these foods help to reduce cholesterol and cardiovascular risk. So polyunsaturated fat-rich foods are things like sunflower oil, margarine spreads made with sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, and those nuts I was talking about, walnuts, Brazil nuts, very high in PUFAs. Seeds, I don't think we use enough seeds in our cooking. Seeds are fantastic. And of course, fish and seafood. We need to be encouraging people to eat seafood twice a week. And it doesn't really matter what kind, excluding the deep fried and battered variety, of course. Okay, so what are monounsaturated fats? We know that we should be replacing saturates with poly and monounsaturates, but what is a monounsaturated fat-rich food? Olive oil, canola, and any spreads made with those two oils, because they're everywhere now, aren't they? You can get olive oil, margarine, you can get all kinds. Peanut oil and good old avocado, which of course comes wrapped up with lots of other good nutrients as well. And macadamia nuts, Australia's native nut. They're one of the richest sources of monounsaturated fats of any food, and they taste divine. Hope you get some for Mother's Day. It's on my list. Okay, so that's the kind of good fat, bad fat story. So we know as well, Paul very elegantly introduced the science around plant sterols. We know that 2 to 3 grams a day of plant sterols will reduce cholesterol. We know it. So how do you make this happen for people? You need to encourage them to include plant sterol-enriched foods, such as the margarine spreads, like the Flora Proactive on your table. There's also one other product, it's milk, that's got plant sterols added. So you've got a couple of options. You need to check the label for plant sterol content. People say, where do I get this stuff? And you can give them brand names, but just, also say to them, look, just check the label if they're not sure about the brand. Aiming for 3 serves a day of plant sterol-enriched foods, whether it be margarine or milk, will get them to the sweet spot. Enough plant sterols to reduce their cholesterol by around 10% on average. And on that photo, I stole that from the Choice magazine story about plant sterol-enriched foods, but they found that margarine spreads were the most affordable way to get the 2 to 3 grams a day. And I know people always say, the margarines are too expensive, but actually they're cheaper than the equal. So And you also have to look at how much medication costs and how much supplement costs. I think at the end of the day, something like, 25, 30 cents a day, it's small change compared with the risk reduction you can get. So plant sterols work. Please encourage them because they work. What are they? People will always ask you this. Well, plant sterols are naturally occurring, but they only occur in very small amounts in many, many different foods, whether it be grains, seeds, even some vegetables like avocado. So they occur naturally, but in our normal everyday diet, we don't get enough to have the effect that we really want. So this is where plant sterol-enriched foods come into their own. Even vegetarians who eat heaps more plant sterol-containing foods naturally will only get about 500 milligrams a day of plant sterols, whereas, as I just explained, you can get 2 to 3 grams when you use plant sterol-enriched products. So they're naturally occurring, it's just that they're present in higher amounts in these enriched foods. So how do they work? You must get asked this. Well, actually, plant sterols help reduce the amount of cholesterol that is absorbed from the gut. Okay, so they're working on the gut. We know that statins work on the liver. 2 different mechanisms, okay? Plant sterols, when you consume them, stop cholesterol being absorbed by your gut. That's how they work. And when you absorb less cholesterol from your gut, your blood levels go down. Another question I get asked a lot is, how do plant sterols interact with statin medication? The good news is because they work in 2 different ways, they are complementary to each other. So even if someone's taking a statin, they're going to get benefits over and above by including plant sterol-rich foods. They work together. As this graph beautifully shows, you'll get more and better reductions when you have plant sterols on top of, even if they're taking statins. That's great news. Again, nuts. I'm very excited about nuts. The best thing about nuts is that when you tell people to eat them, you can see them lighten. It's something yummy and delicious that you're telling them to do. That's good for them. This is the best advice you're ever going to give anyone, okay? It's easy, it's delicious. And really, really positively, having a handful of nuts most days has been shown to reduce cardiovascular risk by up to half. Can you believe it? And it tastes fantastic. So please go out and preach to the masses about the goodness of nuts because they really, really work and they taste fantastic. If you're worried about weight gain, by the way, there have been studies done and they don't. Eating nuts, within a balanced diet does not add to weight gain. In fact, the studies have shown quite the opposite is the trend, okay? It's something about nuts, they're filling, they're high in fibre, they're nutritious, and they don't gain weight. So it's a healthy food we should be encouraging, so get out there and tell them. Okay. What also works with cholesterol lowering is including foods rich in soluble fibre. Now, we know that fibre is good for us, yes. I'm not sure if you appreciate that there's actually several different kinds of fibre, and it's this soluble kind of fibre that has excellent metabolic benefits. So the ones you might have heard of is the good old oat bran. Heard a lot about oat bran. Oat bran and barley, by the way, contain beta-glucan, which is just a kind of soluble fibre that's excellent. You can also find it in vegetables and fruits. And, when it comes down to it, if you can encourage people to have 2 fruit and 5 veg most days, they're going to be on it. Okay, don't get too caught up in the particular kinds. Just get that message out there and chances are they're going to get the soluble fibre that they need. Beans and legumes, we know it's the International Year of Pulses. I don't know if you know that, but it is. And beans and legumes are fantastic. They're also great sources of soluble fibre that help lower cholesterol. And of course, things that your patients have probably asked you about, and that is psyllium. because psyllium's the component of metamucil, among other things, and you can also get it added to food, and you can add it to food yourself. But psyllium is a really good source of soluble fibre, so you can encourage that as well. So are the recommendations changing around diet for cholesterol lowering and diet for reducing cardiovascular risk? Well, I think Paul's shown you probably the biggest difference is about talking about quality of carbohydrates. We now know, fat quality is important, but so is carbohydrate quality. That's probably the biggest change that's come out of the evidence base of late. The rest of it hasn't really changed, but gosh, you wouldn't know it from reading the women's mags and reading the internet. Not as much has changed as people sometimes think, because fad diets are so popular. They just go viral, and they're like a virus. It's an excellent analogy. So we've got paleo, gluten-free, low-carb, high-fat. I mean, they're out there. People are seeing it. We have social media that is able to escalate and spread misinformation very efficiently. Bane of my life, but I'm getting on there to get even. The rise of celebrity culture. I mean, if a celebrity does something, well, it must be true. I got to do it too. Declining scientific literacy in the community is a big issue, and it's why anti-vaxxers are getting such traction as well. It's why, there's people out there denying climate change. A lot of people don't get science, and we have to actually go back to being a bit like science teachers with patients to give them the basics. One study does not evidence make, We also have the death of expertise. This is quite unfortunate. When patients come in and say, look, I've looked it up on the internet and it says this. I mean, what would I know? I've only been doing this for 20 years. You probably get this all the time. And it's a phenomenon. It's not just you and me. This is happening at large. It's called the death of expertise, and it's about the traction of the internet and myths and misinformation. Of course, people are going to want to have simple solutions. I mean, bless them, of course they want it to be simple. Unfortunately, it's not always, but we can do simple things like say, hey, why don't you just switch from butter to margarine and have a handful of nuts, and yay, you'll be making progress. And of course, the media love controversy. They don't care that all this stuff they've been putting up about saturated fats is not supported by the body of evidence and it's considered a fringe view. They don't care about that. They want to get the story out there, and they want to get maximum clickbait. Yeah, they want people to click on stuff and talk about it. So they got no interest in public health. So you just need to kind of get that at that level, and then you can be in a position to fight it with patients. So where are patients at? I mean, they're getting sucked in by all this stuff. They say, I'm on statins, why do I need to care about diet? Well, I've just given you an excellent example of why they do. And the other really important point is statins only address one risk factor. Diet addresses all of the modifiable risk factors, all of them. Good to know. People say, oh, well, I've cut out all the fat, as if that's a good thing to do. Okay, the low-fat diet is dead. We need to get that through to clients. Do not cut out all the fat. That is wrong. It is bad. You will get negative effects. You have to have good fats. You replace bad fats with good fats. You don't throw all the fat away. Very important. Butter's natural. Yeah, right. So's lard and so's oxygen, but it will kill you if you get too much. Okay? Yeah, not an argument. I read coconut oil is the best oil, and that's what Pete Evans says I should be having. No. In fact, the coconut debate is not really a debate when you look at the literature. It's quite clear. Coconut oil is really high in saturated fats and should be considered a sometimes food. And it will not help you lose weight, and it's not even rich in medium chain triglycerides, which a lot of the personal trainers come and tell me, oh, it's an MCT. You might have to go back to your chemical textbooks because it's not, okay? 90% saturated. End of. Okay. Okay, the old chestnut margarine spreads are bad for you. Don't you know they're 1 molecule away from plastic? Oh my God. I mean, where do these people get this stuff? On the internet. I know where they get it. I've seen it. But yes, margarine spread is not bad for you. In fact, it's recommended by the Heart Foundation and the Dietary Guidelines for Australians. It's made out of oil. You make margarine from oil. You get some runny oil, you get a little bit of hard oil, you mix them together, you add some salt, and hey presto, you can make it yourself if you like. You can go online and learn how to make margarine. It's actually quite fun. So the other thing is, they say, I don't use margarine. You say, well, Mr. Smith, you could reduce your cholesterol by 10% by including some, fluoroproactive. And he goes, oh, no, I don't use margarine. That all goes back to the fear of fat. The same patients will be saying, I don't eat any fats, I'll be fine. Okay, you need to get through the message that it's good fats, not no fats. And also there is a very beautiful study done by Murray Scaife, who Paul Nestel mentioned before. He works in New Zealand. He did a fantastic study where he compared with people with high cholesterol, people using margarine and people not, and guess who had the best results? The people using the margarine. Okay, so margarine is good. It's an everyday food. It's recommended by all the health experts instead of butter. So that's all good. A lot of people say, I can't eat nuts because they're fattening. No, they're not. And especially if you stick to that 1 to 2 handfuls a day and they're not chocolate coated. I should just... Oh, damn. Sorry, you had your heart set on that, didn't you? Oh, it's Mother's Day's okay, all right? Mother's Day, you can have chocolate coated nuts. Saturated fats are okay now. I read it. And, you can see the front cover of Time magazine has such headlines. Unfortunately, this is falling into the trap of saying one study is enough to change practice throughout the world. It's not. That's not how evidence-based practice works. The majority of good science evidence says replace saturated fats with unsaturated, and for cardiovascular risk, it will go down. The other one I hear too, especially from a little bit more in foodie type people, is, I only use olive oil. Well, that's fine, good on you, but you need to have a variety of different fats in the diet. Olive oil's only monounsaturated and tastes great in Mediterranean cooking, but, diversify. Use a variety of different oils and one that best suits the dish. As I said, no point using extra virgin olive oil to make your curry. No point. You lose the flavour. So, advice to patients in a nutshell. Get your fats right. The low-fat diet is dead, and happy days because flavour is back, because fats help with flavour, right? You need to replace saturated fats with unsaturated fats. Do not throw the fat out, just choose the good stuff. Include 2 to 3 grams a day of plant sterols. It will reduce cholesterol by an average of 10%. And success breeds confidence and more success with patients. Once they see those numbers change, yay, they're on it. They're converts, devotees. Enjoy a handful or 2 of nuts a day, preferably unsalted and definitely not chocolate coated. But yeah, sorry about that. And include foods rich in soluble fibre. And overwhelmingly, the best thing I could suggest to you today and to educate your patients and clients is do not believe everything you hear and be very, very sceptical about where you get your information because there's so much rubbish out there at the moment. Yeah, be smart, be savvy. Thank you very much. We're going to have some questions, my favourite part. Come on up, Paul.
We've got time for a few quick questions.
Yes, question down the front, yes. Yep, okay, sorry. Get in line. Yes.
What about chia seeds?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What about chia seeds? Chia.
Oh, chia seeds, sorry. Yeah, great. Like I said, chia seeds, all seeds are rich in unsaturated fats and your body's going to be able to access those and especially in chia, it's got a softer shell. Things like linseed's got a very hard shell. You basically have to smash it to get the good stuff out. No, chia's awesome, and yeah, all the seeds are great. I encourage you to use them, sprinkled on the breakfast cereal, or chia makes a fantastic, easy peasy overnight bircher muesli. You just stick it in there with some oats, and it just swells up. It's delicious. Mix some yogurt and maybe a bit of grated apple. Leave it in the fridge, and you got breakfast ready. Yeah, chia's awesome. So all seeds, all nuts, they're all fantastic.
I'm Cheryl from Murwillumbah in northern New South Wales.
Hi, Cheryl from Murwillumbah. Hi.
I just wondered, is there any truth in, I've heard that when you heat olive oil it can be bad.
Yeah.
Is that true?
No.
Too high
Yes. Cheryl's question is, I've heard that if you heat olive oil to a high temperature, it can be bad. Okay. There's a lot of misinformation about oils. In a domestic situation, you're not using very high temperatures. Even deep frying's only 190 degrees Celsius, okay? So you will know that if you've reached a bad point of too much heat on your oil when it starts to smoke. And that's why you use, say, for barbecuing, where it is going to get high temperatures, you use an oil with a high smoke point. But most domestic cooking applications aren't that hot. And with olive oil, it's actually a monounsaturated oil, which makes it more stable. So there's no problem with doing it. With extra virgin olive oil, you can still heat it. Knock yourself out. It's very expensive. I mean, I personally don't use a lot of extra virgin for cooking. I'll use regular and use extra virgin for drizzling, because then you're not going to damage the very, very beneficial phytochemicals and the antioxidants that extra virgin olive oil is so well known for. But yeah, domestic cooking never gets that hot really, so don't worry about it.
Sorry, hi, my name's Mara. I'm from the Northern Territory. Just very quickly, I've always heard peanuts are bad, but peanuts are good.
Peanuts are great. Like in all the big epidemiological studies where they've shown this dramatic risk reduction in nut consumption, many of them have been conducted in the United States. And you know what their number one source of nuts is? Peanut butter. So even if you smash them up and put them in a jar, they still do you good. So any nuts are good. Have a variety. Have what you enjoy. And my God, some of these myths just make life so much harder, don't they? That's why I love my job, because I'm actually making people eat well, and it's easy, Just ignore all that rubbish, and you'll be fine.
There's a hierarchy in nuts, because the fatty acid composition of nuts does vary. And probably of all of them, sort of walnuts have been shown to be the best of all nuts. And whereas I agree with Nicole about peanuts, it was graded lower because it has less polyunsaturated, it's more monounsaturated. But I agree, all nuts are good. Just make sure that you don't break your teeth on some of these.
It's an issue, especially for our more frail elderly folk.
Hi, my question was relating to low-fat yogurt. How do you balance that extra sugar which so many of the brands put in against the benefits?
Yeah. I'm familiar with Sarah Wilson and her semi-religious zeal about sugar. Unfortunately, her zeal is not really matched by the scientific evidence. Look, I think a little bit of sugar in a low-fat yogurt is really no big deal, honestly. With myself, what I do with my little, because I've got a little bloke and I want him to try and not prefer too much sweet things, only 3. So what I do is I mix up natural yogurt and flavoured yogurt together, so it's just a little bit less sweet. But when it comes to me, I just have the low-fat stuff with the sugar. It's really not a big deal, Like, really, can we get things in perspective?
The population studies that have now uniformly shown the benefits of increased yogurt consumption have been based on all kinds of yogurts, low fat, normal fat, sugar added. There's something in fermented dairy that nobody understands as yet, which appears to be beneficial.
Thanks. So is there an amount of yogurt that is the right amount to recommend?
Well, the dietary guidelines, in order for you to get enough calcium, the rough rule of thumb is 3 serves of dairy a day, and you can choose whatever you want, like whether it be for the benefits. I don't think we know really. I think, you know, in terms of practical benefits, get what people will eat. You know, if they can have yogurt every day, happy days.
Oh, I think we might end on this last question over here.
I have a question about genetically modified foods. What do you think about this?
Oh, that's a Dorothy Dix over the last question of the day. Good God. My personal opinion, by the way, we don't have them in the Australian food supply, so it's kind of like an academic question. But in my opinion, I think there's a lot of benefits that can be gained if the technology is well managed. But yeah, it's not really an issue in the Australian food supply as yet. But I think there's a lot of bad press that probably doesn't deserve it, but we need to manage it wisely.
I've been on some committees for the Academy of Science that look very carefully at genetically modified foods. We could find absolutely no evidence that it does any harm in human consumption. And in different countries there's quite a bit. Tomatoes, potatoes, all kinds of genetically modified foods.
Thank you very much. Just a big round of applause to Paul and Nicole. Louise just wants to do a wrap-up, so we'll just let Louise up for a few minutes and then we'll be done.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you all for coming along this morning, and thank you to our fantastic speakers, Professor Nestel and Nicole Senior. Hopefully you've all either learnt something new or perhaps regained some confidence with the advice that you give your patients or clients. It is a really difficult time, and it is hard to you start questioning yourself as a health professional as to whether you're doing the right thing.